It was 1,885, and the Montana hills were as quiet as a graveyard when Caleb Vane rode in, ready to claim what was legally his. What he didn't expect was a girl standing on that threshold, asking for something far more valuable than land. The mist rolled in thick from the east, blanketing everything in an eerie silence, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb could feel the chill in the air as he rode through it, the distant smell of pine and frost mixing in the breeze. His horse's breath fogged the air as they moved through the fog, the ground beneath them cold and damp from the early spring thaw. At 31 years old, Caleb Vane was no stranger to hard work and hard choices. A former soldier turned landowner, he had learned that life wasn't about sentiment or emotion, it was about duty. He was on a mission, and it was simple. His cousin had purchased the land through the government auction, and Caleb was here to take possession. The law had given him every right to it. A piece of paper, signed and stamped by federal offices in Helena, ensured that this land was his. No questions, no arguments. But as he approached the homestead, everything changed. The mist parted as he neared the cabin, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. At first, Caleb thought it was a boy, but as the fog cleared further, he saw the woman. A young woman, barely out of her teens, standing tall with raw strength in her posture. Her faded dress hung loose around her, the hem frayed, and her hair chestnut brown fell loosely around her face. She stood there, not with fear in her eyes, but with something much stronger determination. "Please, just spare him," she said, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Her words, though soft, cut through the silence like a knife. "Take me instead." Caleb blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. A girl, offering herself in exchange for her father's life? It didn't make sense. He had come to claim the land. The deed was in his pocket, a legal document from the government itself. But the girl was offering something else, something far more complicated than land. She wasn't begging for mercy, not in the way a person might expect. There was no desperation in her voice, no hint of weakness. Instead, there was a quiet strength, a strength that made Caleb pause, made him question everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The land was his, by law. But was it worth more than a human life? First encounter and tension. The fog began to lift as Caleb dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he walked toward the porch. The air was thick with tension. Rosalind Dunn, the young woman standing before him, didn't look like someone who had ever been given a fair chance in life. Her dress was worn thin, the sleeves frayed from years of use. Her hands were rough, blistered from work, and yet there was a fierceness in her eyes that told Caleb she had been fighting long before he showed up. He stood still for a moment, staring at her, trying to make sense of it all. "I'm looking for Jeremiah Dunn," he said. His voice was steady, but inside, his mind was racing. "This is his homestead," she replied, her voice cracking, barely audible over the wind. Her gaze stayed steady, meeting his without fear. The silence between them stretched on. Caleb's eyes flicked to the cabin behind her. The roof was patched with tin, and the chimney had a thin thread of smoke curling from it. Someone was inside. Someone was still alive. He glanced back at Rosalind, unsure what to say. She didn't wait for him to speak. Her words were soft but desperate. "Please," she repeated. "Just spare him." Caleb frowned, confusion washing over him. What was this girl asking for? He had come for the land. His duty was clear. The law was on his side, and that was all that mattered. Yet, something about Rosalind's calm, steadfast face made him hesitate. She wasn't offering money. She wasn't begging for her life. She was offering herself. "Take me instead," she said again, her voice trembling just slightly, but her eyes never wavered. The request was too much, too outlandish to consider. Yet, Caleb found himself staring at her, his hand unconsciously resting on the land deed in his pocket. The paper, the law, the land, all of it seemed suddenly so small, so insignificant in the face of her offer. He didn't know how to respond. He had come here with a purpose, and yet, in that moment, everything felt like it was slipping away from him. The land, the law, the justice, none of it seemed to matter. There was only Rosalind, standing in front of him, offering the one thing he could never have imagined. The tension grows. Caleb's hand tightened around the edge of the deed, his fingers cold against the parchment. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He had been trained to follow orders, to carry out his duty without question. He had fought in battles where the only thing that mattered was victory, not the lives lost along the way. But here, in front of him, was a situation that defied every lesson he had ever learned. Rosalind stood before him, her hands trembling slightly, her gaze unwavering. Her father, the man Caleb had come to evict, was sick. Caleb could see it in her eyes, the fear, the worry, the desperation. She wasn't asking for mercy for herself. She was asking him to spare the man who had raised her, the man who had worked that land with his own hands, the man who had earned his right to it, in ways Caleb could never understand. The faint smell of wood smoke wafted in the air, and Caleb could hear the distant sound of footsteps inside the cabin. He knew that Rosalind wasn't lying. Her father was inside, and if the doctor's warnings were true, Jeremiah Dunn wouldn't survive much longer. And yet, Caleb still clung to the law. The land was his, bought fair and square. It didn't matter who had worked it. It didn't matter who had suffered. The law was the law, and Caleb had no intention of breaking it. "Please," Rosalind's voice cracked as she spoke again. "Take me instead. Let him stay." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to believe that law and order would win out. He had lived his life by it. But now, standing in front of this young woman, offering her own future for her father's, he wasn't sure anymore. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he forced himself to speak. "I'm not a man who takes people's homes for pleasure," he said, his voice rough. "But the law says this land belongs to me." Rosalind's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't break down. She didn't beg. She just stood there, waiting, hoping that somehow Caleb would see the truth in her words. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Caleb said quietly, more to himself than to her. The fog seemed to swallow his words, but the weight of the decision hung heavy on his shoulders. Past trauma and the burden of the law, Caleb rode back to his camp that afternoon. The land deed still in his pocket, but it felt heavier than it had before. The day seemed to drag on as he fought against his growing doubts. His mind wandered back to the days when he was a soldier, back to the harsh, unforgiving battles, where the only thing that mattered was survival. He had been trained to follow orders, to uphold the law, and to disregard anything that didn't fit into the neat, orderly framework of justice. But nothing about this felt like justice. He had seen death in all its forms. The battlefield had been a place where rules were bent, broken, and disregarded. But here, in the middle of the Montana wilderness, it was different. This was personal. The land wasn't a battlefield, it was a home. And Rosalind wasn't a soldier, she was a daughter, a woman who had lived and worked for this land her whole life. Caleb stared into the flickering flames of his campfire that evening, the smell of boiling coffee filling the air. His thoughts drifted back to his time in the military, where the difference between right and wrong had always been clearly defined. But now, as he sat alone in his camp, the lines between right and wrong seemed far more blurred. Was following the law always the right choice? Was it worth the price of a human life? The land was Caleb's by legal right, but it was no longer about legality, it was about what was right. The law versus the heart. The next morning, Caleb returned to the homestead, the land deed still in his hand. He had promised to return, but the promise felt hollow now. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps on the porch as he approached, and when he looked up, he saw Rosalind standing in the doorway again, waiting for him. "I'm here to settle this," he said, his voice steady, though his insides were anything but. Rosalind didn't speak at first. She simply stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The cabin was small, its wood walls weathered and worn, but it had a certain warmth to it. Caleb couldn't help but notice the signs of hard work, of a life built from nothing but sweat and determination. Jeremiah was sitting in a chair by the fire, his face pale and thin, but his eyes were sharp, watching Caleb like a hawk. Caleb felt a pang of guilt in his chest. "You came to take my land," Jeremiah said quietly, his voice hoarse but steady. "But you didn't come to take my life." Caleb's stomach tightened. He had never seen a man so resigned, so accepting of his fate. Caleb tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. Rosalind appeared in the doorway, holding a bowl of broth for her father. She didn't look at Caleb, but her hands trembled as she set it down. Caleb knew then that this wasn't about the land. This was about family and love, and the price they were all willing to pay to survive. The decision is made. Caleb stood motionless for a moment, the land indeed heavy in his hands, but the weight of it felt different now. He had expected this to be a simple transaction, a matter of legal right, but the situation before him was more complicated than he had imagined. Jeremiah looked at Caleb, his gaze piercing, yet full of the sorrow of a man who had already lost so much. "My land isn't just dirt and wood. It's my wife's grave. It's where my children grew up. It's all we have left." His voice wavered, but his eyes held steadfast. "It's all she has left." Caleb's eyes moved to Rosalind. She stood there, her face pale but strong. She didn't look like someone who had a choice. She looked like someone who had already given everything she could, and now all she had left was her offer. She was offering him everything she had left herself. Not out of weakness, but out of a fierce love for her father. She wasn't asking for mercy. She wasn't asking for pity. She was asking for something that Caleb couldn't fully understand, but something he couldn't ignore. She was asking him to spare her father's life by taking her own future. "Please," Rosalind said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's all I have. Take me instead." The words echoed in Caleb's mind. His eyes shifted to the land, and then back to Rosalind. The land was a place, but it was also a symbol of everything they had lost and fought for. Caleb could feel the storm inside him raging. He had come here with one purpose, but now that purpose seemed so insignificant in the face of her sacrifice. The deed was in his hand, and it had the power to change everything. But what would it change? The law said the land was his, but law wasn't the only thing that mattered in a world like this. There were decisions made from the heart, decisions that couldn't be explained on paper. "I can't take you," Caleb said finally, his voice hoarse. "You're not a thing to be traded. I'm not asking you to buy me," she answered. "I'm asking you to spare him," Caleb exhaled sharply. He wanted to believe that the law would make this simple, that he could walk away and return to his life, knowing that he had done what was right by the letter of the law. But he couldn't. He knew it. Rosalind's eyes, her strength, and her love for her father were clearer than any legal document. "I can't take everything from you," Caleb said, looking at both of them. "I can't take this land." But his heart was torn. He wasn't just talking about the property. He was talking about something deeper: hope, dignity, the trust of a family who had worked for everything they had. "I'll come back tomorrow," Caleb said, his voice quiet. Rosalind didn't thank him. She didn't say a word. She simply stood there, watching him as he turned away, his boots crunching in the dirt. But as he mounted his horse and looked back, he saw her figure standing in the doorway. The fog was rolling in again, and in that moment, he realized something. He was no longer just a man coming for land. He was a man standing at a crossroads between duty and humanity. Breaking point. The morning Caleb returned, the fog had lifted, and the sun had begun to break through the clouds. The land, with its uneven furrows and worn-down fences, seemed to mirror the struggles of the people who had worked it. As he approached the homestead, he saw Rosalind standing by the fence, hammering in a new post. Her movements were deliberate, but there was something off about it. The post she was driving into the ground was beyond the boundary of her father's land, technically on Caleb's property now. Caleb dismounted and walked toward her. He hadn't come here for a confrontation. He had come to settle things, but now, as he stood watching her work, he understood that this wasn't just about the land. This wasn't about deeds or law or who owned what. This was about survival. "You can't keep doing this," Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. Rosalind didn't stop hammering. Her face was set in determination, but Caleb could see the cracks, the exhaustion in her eyes, the weariness in her shoulders. She wasn't fighting him for land. She was fighting for time. "My father's not well," she said, her voice low. "He has enough strength left to fight for this land one last time. We just need one more harvest. After that, we'll go. But until then, we need this." Caleb watched her as she continued hammering the post into the ground. It was then that he realized Rosalind wasn't asking for mercy. She wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for something that he could give, something simple, yet profound: time. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the hammer as it hit the wood. Caleb felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He could take the land. It was his, by law. But Rosalind's hands, blistered from work, told a different story. This land wasn't just a piece of earth. It was their life. Caleb turned toward her, his voice softer now. "I won't take this from you." She paused and looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You'll let us stay?" Caleb nodded once. No words were needed. It was a quiet understanding that neither of them would speak aloud, but both would live by. The arrival of Morgan days later, Caleb's cousin Morgan arrived, a man from back east, accustomed to wealth and power. He didn't understand the land. He didn't understand the struggle. He understood only profit. When Morgan arrived in his polished boots and crisp clothes, Caleb could see it in his eyes, the gleam of a man who saw land only as a means to expand his wealth, not as something tied to people's hearts. "You were supposed to clear them out," Morgan said, his voice sharp with impatience. "You promised me that land, Caleb." Caleb stood his ground, unwavering. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. Morgan was used to getting his way. He was used to paying for what he wanted. But Caleb wasn't just another man who could be bought. This land had become something more. Morgan looked at him with disdain. "This is business, Caleb. You're not here to make friends." "No," Caleb said quietly. "I'm here to do what's right." Climax, breaking Morgan's hold. The tension between Caleb and Morgan reached its peak when Morgan's men started sabotaging the Dunn's land. Fences were cut, fields were trampled. Caleb could feel the anger bubbling inside him. But he didn't act out of impulse. He acted out of something deeper: responsibility. When Morgan's men arrived to expand their fence lines past the Dunn property, Caleb was waiting. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his arms crossed, a silent barrier between them and the land that no longer belonged to Morgan. "You're making a mistake, Caleb," Morgan said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is about the law? It's about power, and you don't have it." Caleb looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to explain. His actions spoke louder than any words could. The resolution and reflection. The dust had settled. Morgan was gone, arrested for his crimes. Caleb had stood his ground, not just for the land, but for what was right. He had given Rosalind and her father their peace. In the days that followed, Caleb gave back half of the land. It wasn't because he was obligated, but because he had learned something more valuable than legal rights. He had learned the importance of love, sacrifice, and what it meant to truly belong to the land. As the camera zoomed out, Caleb and Rosalind stood side by side, their figures framed against the setting sun. The land wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It was a promise made not through ink and paper, but through action and understanding. Sometimes the greatest things in life are earned, not through laws, but through choices that defy them.